The biggest thing I find with yeast is sinus infections. So yeast really likes to live in your sinus cavity. So they'll get repeated sinus infection, postnasal drip, a lot of brain fog. So everything to do with the head tends to be more yeast related. If you're finding, of course, like even recurrent yeast infections is an obvious one, or even I've seen recurrent urinary tract infections can also be yeast related. And of course, if you're growing or finding rashes underneath very moist areas, armpits, under the breasts, in between the thighs, of course, in the vaginal or penile region, like a lot of places where the moisture tends to build up. Those would be clear cut signs of yeast that we'd want to at least rule out.
Hey folks, it's Mike Mutzel here with highintensityhealth.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to episode number 118. Today we're live with Andrea Maxim. She's a naturopathic physician in the Ontario area, Toronto suburbs. And today we're going to talk about parasites, Candida, and all sorts of bug pathogens. And also she recently had a baby. And so we're going to kind of pick her brain on some of the ways that her life has changed and how she's managed her time running a business, being a parent, and so forth. So Dr. Maxim, thanks for being here.
Hey, my pleasure. I'm glad to be back.
Awesome. So before we dive into all the fun stuff about bugs and parasites and Candida, share with us, if you would, a little bit about your journey after having a child and still maintaining a business and being an author and stuff like that. How has your life changed and what's new for you?
You know what? It's funny because you always think of having a child as a life-changing event, and it certainly is. But because I'm a business owner and I'm kind of the face of my practice, I only took about 5 weeks off. Now, in the States, I know 6-week maternity leave is quite common, but here in Canada, most women are taking a year off. So to a lot of my friends, they're like, oh my goodness, how are you able to do that only 5 weeks? But for me, as an entrepreneurial sort of spirit, that actually helped keep me motivated to keep going. Having a family now has really brought my butt into high gear to know that now I really want to provide for my family and offer them all the luxuries that we ever want without worrying about financial burdens and things like that. So if anything, she really helped to number one, she offered me a lot of good grounding balance. So when I come home, I spend time with her. I don't think about work as much. I just focus on her. But when it's work time, it's game time, right? Mm-hmm. So, forcing yourself to definitely make a few sacrifices here and there with my time, but always being present when I'm at home. So that balance took a long time, especially now that she's a year old. She's more independent and it's a little bit easier to get away, and she's in daycare now. But that first 6 to 8 months when they're completely dependent on you is a real personal struggle for me. I don't know if I'm a built-in infant mom. Like it just wasn't the best fit. I found that very stressful. Now, mind you, as the family grows, it hopefully will get easier. But that was a very interesting time for me because I really didn't know exactly how to be a mom and a business owner. But now it's so much easier and she's amazing. So I definitely don't regret the whole experience at all. And we're actually, working on the second one. So a year from now, then we can discuss what it's like to have 2 kids running around.
That's fantastic. Well, I can tell you as a parent, my daughter's 3 years old, it gets better and better. So in the best years are ahead for you. And I think parenting is like as a lot of parents, with kids that have grown on and so forth that are older now say it's the hardest job in the world, because there's really no manual. You're learning as you go. But I'm sure you're doing a great job with that. So as someone who focuses on hormones, in your clinical practice, how has your hormones shifted? We know women after they have babies say that their metabolism changes, they have more belly fat and different, looser skin, things like that. So knowing that you have your fingers on the pulse of, integrative hormone balancing and so forth, what have you noticed in your own body and any solutions for moms out there to help them get their, pre-baby weight back?
Well, I guess the big thing that I always thought about, and I found this very interesting, is as soon as Aria was born, it's like the best weight loss program ever. You just drop 20 pounds immediately, right? Because you just gave birth to a little human. And I found people would look at me and they're like, man, you look really great for having a child. And it really got me thinking. And I was like, why can't women look great right after having a baby? Like, the big thing, the mainstay for me was I really wanted to make sure that just because I was pregnant didn't mean that I get to eat an extra 1,000 calories a day. And it didn't mean that I get to become obese because I'm pregnant. I really wanted to stay within the regulated weight gain. So I didn't gain any more than 30 pounds, which is quite normal for the average female. And so when the baby is born, because you haven't what's the best way to say this? You haven't, taken advantage of the situation. Bouncing back is quite easy. Now, of course, the older you are, the more your hormones become imbalanced as it is. But my cycles going in were completely treated and they were completely regular. So coming out of them, it actually regulated itself back. Now, with regards to the way my body looks, of course, there's body changes that as a naturopath, I can't fix.
Yeah.
As a woman, you have to get used to the fact that your hips are going to be a bit wider. Your bum might be a bit bigger. Definitely, if you're not putting the effort into toning your muscles back up, especially your abdominal muscles, it is going to appear as if you have more abdominal fat around the midsection. So a little bit of responsibility has to be taken into account too, that it's not necessarily something outside of your realm to fix. A lot of times, as soon as Aria was born, the amount of times I exercised, I could probably count on my hand. It was very little because I wasn't putting the priority there. Had I put the priority there, I'm sure my body would look exactly the same as it was before getting pregnant. So that's just one kind of advice that I would like to give all women is, number one, just because you're pregnant, you really only need to increase your caloric intake by 250 to 300 calories per day. You don't need to be doubling your portions. Watch sugar cravings, because it was very easy for me to start craving sugar and carbohydrates while I was pregnant. So I had to curb that a little bit to maintain proper weight and proper blood sugar control. And when the pregnancy is over, find ways to exercise and get that tone back, because it's really the lack of muscle tone that makes everything look worse. And your hormones will naturally come back into balance. Mind you, I had a very easy case. It was a very easy pregnancy and an easy postpartum period for me. But there's definitely a lot of women that, depending on their health going into pregnancy, can really have a bit of an upset afterwards. So my biggest piece of advice for anyone who's struggling with postpartum depression, or if you suspect that there's a definite hormonal imbalance, get it tested as soon as possible so it can be treated as quickly as possible. But also don't forget about the lifestyle things that matter too.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And not taking advantage, like you started out that last segment, of not taking advantage of the food and realizing, yes, you are pregnant and you need to increase your calories moderately. It doesn't mean that, cookies and donuts and cupcakes and you can eat whatever you want. And so some of the friends of friends that we have that have struggled with, weight related issues associated with pregnancy, were in that state where they took advantage of it and had the mindset that they can eat whatever the heck they want. And here they are, like 6-8 months, a year later, with all this excess weight. And so it's hard for the body to kind of recalibrate. So in contrast, women that eat real food and stick to their, exercise program as consistently as possible have the same feedback that you gave, was like, oh my gosh, you just had a baby, you look fantastic. So great advice there. And maybe that's a nice transition to talk about Candida and parasites, because we know that the early years play a huge role in our immune system and how our immune system tolerates various bugs. So I know we're going to get into the nitty gritty with Candida and parasites, but let's first talk about the immune system, if you would, a little bit. And a question that comes to mind after watching some of your YouTube videos in preparation for this call was, we've been exposed to these parasites for eons, right? And we're seeing them play a larger and larger role, not just parasites, but bacteria and viruses, for example, in our ill health. Is it because our immune systems are less tolerant? Are they more aggressive bugs? Give us your skinny on why they're such a problem nowadays.
And you know what? I'm going to offer some caution with regards to saying that they're a problem, because they're not a problem. They're environmentally found bacteria, bugs, parasites, or what have you. And the biggest thing that I always tell patients when we discover that there's a parasite overgrowth or a bacterial overgrowth is I say, with animals, for instance, we always get dogs and cats checked for parasites, bacteria, viruses. They always get their updated shots, that sort of thing. And yet we don't quite interpret it with humans the same way. For some reason, I think humans think we're way above the food chain when we're all kind of the same, mammals exposed to the same things.
Sure.
The real question is, why do some people's immune systems react to them more severely than others? And that could come down to genetics. That could come down to the whole hygiene hypothesis, the hygiene hypothesis stating that, especially in industrialized countries, we're using more sanitizers, we're cleaning and sterilizing all surfaces. So children, when their immune systems are primed, when they're, between the ages of 0 and 2, that's when their immune system wants to be exposed to everything because it wants to create a memory response. It needs to be exposed to bugs and dirt and dust and animal dander and all of those things. Whereas now a lot of parents are trying to keep their kids as clean as possible. They're not allowed to interact with other kids as freely as they once were. So that puts a lot of children's immune systems at a disadvantage, because now when they're being exposed to things later on in life, the immune system is like, whoa. We have no idea what this is, and it freaks out. As I said, genetics can always be a big part of this too, right? Some people just have genetic deficiencies where they get exposed to something. For instance, I listened to the podcast where you were speaking to that medical doctor about mold, and it was mind-blowing to me, and how even just genetic defect for mold sensitivity can just be profoundly destructive in certain people. So, when we're thinking about our environment and when we're thinking about our immune system, we do need to be taking into external factors. And we also need to be thinking about, what are the things that are going on in my body or in my family member's body that could be suppressing the immune system. I mean, the obvious things come to mind: processed sugar, smoking, alcohol, things like that. How about food sensitivities? Food sensitivities are an incredibly inflammatory response that can greatly suppress your immune system, cause inflammation of the digestive tract. With inflammation of the digestive tract, right away, your natural microflora are going to start to decline, and they're a huge source of your immune system. Heavy metals, environmental toxins, all of these things that we're getting exposed to more and more are starting to present in people as what we would consider a more symptomatic or a worse outlook of that particular condition. Now, let's also take into consideration antibiotic therapy and how quickly a lot of medications are being prescribed. The thing is you can't underestimate the desire to live that these parasites, bacteria, and yeast have, and they will find ways to keep thriving and surviving. It's no different than any sort of animal population you can think of. So if we start introducing more and more of these medications, well, these bugs are going to say, hey, if I want to keep surviving, if I want to keep proliferating, I'm going to have to find a way to fight against these bugs, these medications. And they will, and they have. And that's why we're now getting superbugs and things that are now antibiotic resistant. And different medications resistant. So, it's all these things taken into consideration. A lot of them can be improved, and we can certainly improve the immune system, but there's some things that are just outside of our control.
You have some signs and symptoms on some of the videos that you've talked about on like headaches and fatigue and various things that people may associate with, say, gluten sensitivity or with leaky gut or with heavy metal exposure. So have you found, having been doing this work for a while, is there any telltale symptoms of parasites versus Candida versus maybe other, factors like food sensitivities and so forth? Like, share with us what the presentation would be. So if someone was listening right now thinking like, yeah, I have those things, I might want to get tested for parasites or Candida. Mm-hmm. What tips?
So with regards to yeast specifically, and I'll try to do one at a time, the biggest thing I find with yeast is sinus infections. So yeast really likes to live in your sinus cavity. So they'll get repeated sinus infection, postnasal drip, a lot of brain fog. So everything to do with the head tends to be more yeast related. If you're finding, of course, like even recurrent yeast infections is an obvious one, or even I've seen recurrent urinary tract infections can also be yeast related. And of course, if you're growing or finding rashes underneath very moist areas, armpits, under the breasts, in between the thighs, of course, in the vaginal or penile region, like a lot of places where the moisture tends to build up. Those would be clear cut signs of yeast that we'd want to at least rule out. For parasites tend to be a little bit sneakier, and they kind of fall under the same line as what food sensitivities can present with. But the key thing I find with parasites is, and with both yeast and parasites, I should say, is a chronic deficiency in your immune system. So getting colds and flus a lot more frequently than normal. Both parasites specifically, I tend to find a lot more random itchiness. So itchiness that just doesn't have an apparent trigger or location, as well as getting rashes on the appendages, so arms, legs. I've even had one patient where he was starting to develop little blisters on his skin, and he could actually pop it, and like little, it almost looked like a rice grain could come out of it, and it was moving. Wow. Totally gross. But totally possible. And he was just massively overburdened with parasites. And after a few months of treatment, felt significantly better. But with parasites, I find that one to be a very unique symptom, is just random itching and weird rashes that kind of appear out of nowhere. Now, of course, very common ones would be itching of the anus if we're talking about pinworms or such. And the other thing about parasites that's unique is they tend to be the most active around the full moon and the least active around the new moon. So if people find that there's some sort of cyclical nature to the way their symptoms are appearing, that's also a sign that you may want to get that at least ruled out. And then for food sensitivities, I mean, it's the most common digestive upset. However, food sensitivities can also present as skin rashes, joint pain, muscle pain. So that's why, and just like I know you've talked with all of your other interviewees, is, we can't just say, this is it. This is the pinpoint answer. This is what you have. You have to do a thorough workup. But with every single patient, I always try to rule out at least the likelihood of any overgrowth of yeast or parasites, because it is just so overlooked and it is so costly to your body's resources, to your immune system, to your energy levels. So you might get patients to a point of 70% better, but they just won't achieve that 100%.
Mm-hmm. And it can be a source of this chronic ongoing inflammation, which is not good, like we talked about with the food sensitivity. So great info. So let's kind of tease apart Candida a little bit. And so what we've, after interviewing like 10 or 12 experts on the gut microbiome, and, a common theme that comes up is, the food that you eat and feed your gut microflora is going to change the phenotype. For example, you eat a diverse diet and all kinds of healthy herbs, spices, and vegetables and things. You're going to have a really diverse microbiome. If you eat a really simple processed, diet, you're going to have foster the growth of bacteria that thrive off carbs and sugar. So is the same true for Candida? Like, I guess the question is, do we all have Candida albicans, like micro amounts? And then when we start eating a lot of sugar and drinking alcohol and things like that, does it flourish, or does it get there by, like, talk about how we get Candida and how it becomes a problem?
So that is my belief, that we always will have a little bit of yeast in us. We will always have a little bit of bad bacteria. We'll always have a little bit of environmental parasites. But yes, it's, again, what are you doing to nurture your body that allows it to allow these parasites or yeast to overgrow? So a lot of people will not classify it as a parasite infection or a yeast infection. It's more of an overgrowth for that particular reason. So, you will always have it. It's just, what are you doing to your body to allow it to monopolize on your system and start presenting symptoms?
And so the types of foods, we know alcohol is a big one, sugar is a big one. Anything else that maybe is a hidden source or hidden trigger on the immune system, which allows yeast to flourish? And then also maybe talk about treatment. I know Partiarco is one. There's a lot of oil of oregano. What have you found to be effective?
So other food sources that I found, the most obvious ones is anything that has yeast in it. So wine, is also a source of yeast. Anything that rises is a source of yeast. So breads that rise, pastries, things like that. So I always make sure that patients remove that as well. And I also look at tropical fruits. So we don't always think about fruits necessarily as a food trigger because it's a natural source of sugar. But if we're thinking about tropical versus locally grown fruits, the tropical fruits are exposed to more sunlight and therefore they produce more glucose and fructose, versus locally grown fruits here, at least in North America, tend not to have as much. So apples and berries and pears are typically fine, but I would definitely refrain from things like oranges and pineapples and bananas, which tend to have a lot more of a sugar content. So that would be some of the other foods to think about. And then I forget your second question.
Oh, it was about treatment, but let's pause there on the foods.
Okay.
One of my favorite foods, as an aside, is it's kind of a cheat food, I guess, is dried mango, and it's loaded with sugar. I just love it. And after eating, this is an N of one, but after eating that, I definitely get bloated, and I feel like there's a brick in my stomach, after eating it. So it's tempting, for people to associate, those high sugary fruits from the tropical regions, mangoes, pineapple, things like that, as being healthy, and they do have some health benefit. Papaya has bromelain and papain and things like that, right? But like you mentioned, those small, low sugar fruits that are high in phytonutrients and fiber are definitely things that people should be including, like in their smoothies and post-workout meals, and try to minimize, the mangoes and pineapples and papaya. Would you kind of agree there?
I would absolutely agree. And that actually brought me to another thought is, and this is very interesting because a patient of mine had a flavored protein powder. So we also have to watch for sources in our supplements, which we would never consider a problem, to have, vanilla flavor, chocolate flavor, berry flavor, even if it's coming from xylitol or stevia or things like that. For some people, just being exposed to that extra amount of sugar really allows those bacteria and fungus to thrive. So you do have to be very careful about a lot of those things.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you get to a point once you achieve like ideal gut health and get rid of the sources of intestinal permeability and get your microbiome on track, where you can have like dried mango or pineapple or papaya in small amounts? Or do you think that for some people, it's just a big no-no no matter what? What are your thoughts there?
I always like to think that if patients and people do everything right, that they've earned the right to go back to the type of lifestyle that they want, keeping in mind that they need to pay attention now. So we always know that health, regardless of what state you're in, will ebb and flow. There's going to be times where you feel amazing, and then other things like stressors or traumas or other triggers can be involved and can just suppress the immune system enough to bring you into a bit of a downswing. So I never want people to think, well, I've done all this hard work and I was so restrictive and I'm starting to feel so much better that I couldn't possibly go back to eating a regular, just eat real food type of diet. But I do always say, your body is so individualized that you have to pay attention to what foods now trigger you. Because for some people, the sensitivity levels are so extreme that any form of sugar is going to cause them to flare up. It doesn't necessarily mean that their yeast is going to come back full force, but it's going to start showing some of those mild symptoms to say, you know what, just watch it a little bit, cut back a little bit. But for myself, and this isn't related to yeast, but as someone who's very dairy sensitive and even lactose intolerant genetically, I can now, because I've done such a great job with my body, eat cheese and yogurt and things like that every once in a while without any problem. But if I do it every single day of the week, I'm going to get backed up and I'm going to feel disgusting and that sort of thing. So, you just always have to pay attention to what your tolerance levels are, because it's so varied. I can't define the answer for one particular person.
Definitely. Yeah. And then it comes back to kind of being honest with yourself. I just had to realize that the dried mangoes were not good for me, even though I absolutely love them. And emotionally, right? I felt like
the stuff we love is usually the stuff we can't have.
Yeah. And I think a big one, Dr. Maxim, is alcohol for people, because we hear that, low doses of alcohol are good for the heart and, the polyphenols in red wine. And so I think a lot of people are emotionally connected to alcohol, and yet they rationalize it with the health benefits that it may confer. So any success stories of patients that have ditched alcohol that you can share with us, or any reasons why you think we should minimize our alcohol consumption?
You know what? I haven't had any success stories that I can think of off the top of my head where someone has completely 100% abstained from alcohol. The only one that comes to mind is I had a gentleman in my office who did my 7-day detox, which I'm pretty sure we talked about in my previous podcast. And he was drinking like a case of beer a week, easy, if not on a weekend. And he had a very, very profound pot belly. And after doing that detox and abstaining from alcohol for 1 week, he lost 15 pounds. And then after doing that for a month continuously, he continued to lose another 15 pounds. So just think about how the empty calories that can be involved in our alcohol consumption. And typically the timing of our alcohol consumption is working against us as well, meaning we're typically having it later on in the evening. So it's not being necessarily balanced with healthy fats and proteins. So it just converts right to sugar again in the system. And I don't have a problem with alcohol per se. I just find that the overconsumption of it is so easy that we start to forget the other nutrients that we need to be taking in into the body as well. So that's why it's such a problem with alcoholics, for instance, is that they are incredibly malnourished because their alcohol is fulfilling their appetite, and it's fulfilling a lot of their food requirements from a mental emotional perspective, let's say, so they forget to eat regular food. So this is, just those little things that I would definitely take into consideration. I'm never going to be one to tell somebody you can never have a drop of alcohol ever again, even if you're pregnant. So even while I was pregnant, I still allowed myself, a half a beer or a beer or a few sips here and there throughout the pregnancy because I wanted to enjoy it. I didn't want to be so restrictive.
Yeah.
My daughter's perfectly fine. So, it just depends on the person, because I will say again, genetically, and we did a lot of genetic testing here, there's a lot of people who cannot metabolize alcohol well. And for them, it's just never going to work. Mm-hmm. And usually the signs that they'll have is like an immediate headache. They immediately feel drunk, if you will. And it takes them a long time to recover from that. So, there's just some people that shouldn't ever have it, but from my perspective, I'm not that type of person that's going to say, no, never again.
Right. Too restrictive. Yeah, great point. Mm-hmm. What I found to be the best kind of remedy for alcohol is to increase your mindfulness and meditation practice, because then you can be more cognizant of your emotions at that time and make better choices and maybe sip on things socially, but not overindulge. So I found that to be true with some friends and, people that I meditate with and talk to about meditation with and so forth. So little tip there. Let's get into testing with Candida before we get into some of the treatment. So a lot of practitioners on the show before have talked about organic acids and how that's a great test to kind of give insight into Candida exposure. What are you recommending?
I think the organic acids test for Candida, bacterial, and other fungal markers is phenomenal. And it's just a urine test, which is why it's so profound. And it not only shows those things, it shows basically how your whole body is functioning. So that is always a mainstay test in my office. The other one that's very common is stool testing. And so a lot of patients, when they suspect they have parasites, will go to their medical doctors and they'll run the basic parasite and ova stool test. And they more often than not, 9 times out of 10 will come back negative, which then the patients and the medical doctors may not believe that it's actually a problem. So the thing of it is, and this is the way I think about it, is in the stool, if the parasites are living there, then they know they're going to get eliminated. So why would they want to be there necessarily? So what I always recommend people to do is, if you're going to invest in, a better test would be a comprehensive stool analysis. If you're going to invest in it, start doing some yeast and parasite cleansing for a week or two to really get them being eliminated from the bloodstream, from the joints, from the muscle, from the liver, from the different tissues that they like to live in, and get them moving into the bowels, so that when you do the test, you'll actually see a better idea of what you're being exposed to. Because otherwise, I just would hate to have people spend hundreds of dollars and have it come back negative, which a lot of the times they do, and it's still actually the real root cause of their problem.
That's great information. So it's almost like a parasite / Candida stress test, like you're disturbing their ecosystem so how do you disturb their ecosystem? What sort of nutrients or maybe pharmaceuticals do you like to recommend?
Now, with regards to my practice, I don't do pharmaceuticals all that much. I'm not against them. I think they definitely have their purpose, and especially for some of those nasty conditions, they're the fastest way to get rid of them, like metronidazole and, of course, Canestin and things like that. However, what I like to use a lot of in my practice is high-dosed garlic. Delayed release garlic. We use a lot of black walnut combination with wormwood. And I tend to use a lot of homeopathics as well, especially for children, because the homeopathics are, in drop dosage. So you can put it into their bottle or sippy cup, because kids are just a cesspool for bugs. And
Right.
a lot of kids and infants tend to have symptoms of parasite or yeast overgrowth, which is causing their colds and flus and skin rashes and things like that. So removing the parasites for kids especially is incredibly important. But you always have to remember that if you have it, that you have to make sure that your family members are getting treated. Parasites especially can be transferred through saliva. So if you're getting kisses from your family members, or, of course, having sexual intercourse with your partner, it can be transferred that way. And with regards to yeast and women that are getting recurrent yeast infections, men are typically asymptomatic carriers. So they just keep giving it back every single time. And the women have no idea why they continue to get yeast infections. So you do have to kind of treat the whole family as well.
Wow, really great tips there. And yeah, it scares me sometimes, but I know it's eventually good for my daughter. Is she'll kiss the dogs and touch the fork, touch her mouth, and all this sort of stuff. But she's had no real immune or health challenges in her 3.5 short years of life, and so I think it's probably overall a good thing. But it's amazing what kids are exposed to because they're crawling around on the ground, especially when they're like little guys. So that's a good point. The homeopathics, just to kind of keep things in check. So maybe any specifics on dosages, for you said black walnut and garlic, and I know oil of oregano, a lot of practitioners like that and so forth, like with meals, away from meals, at night, like any specifics there for people that want to experiment?
With regards to dosing, I don't want to be giving any wrong doses because it always depends on the company. Some companies make it more potent and some companies make it less potent. With the liquid tinctures that I tend to use, like the black walnut combination, I usually recommend 30 drops 3 to 4 times a day. And that's pretty standard across the board. If it's a yeast, like a berberis combination or a black walnut combination in capsule, usually 1 capsule 3 to 4 times a day. And I always recommend to take herbs away from food because herbs typically work best on an emptier stomach. Not saying that you have to wait 2 hours to take it, but just try to keep it away from your major meal. It doesn't matter what time of the day to me. If before bed works, awesome. If first thing in the morning works, great. It's not only the herbs, but it's of course the dietary changes as well. So all of that is wonderful. When it comes to the homeopathics, again, it all depends on the company. We have different companies here than I think you do in the States. So dosage kind of depends there. But what I will say is do not expect that infection to be gone or overgrowth to be gone after the first 30 days. So you're looking at a minimum of 30 days of treatment. If not, some people I have on a parasite cleanse for months and months. Because after we retest, it does, well, let me put it this way. Sometimes what you see on the initial test is just what's at the surface. So as you start the treatment and as you start pulling more of these parasites or yeast out of their hiding places, you might find that it actually gets worse before it gets better. So continuing to retest is also incredibly important. And I will never put anybody on a yeast or parasite cleanse without actually getting some data to prove that it exists. Because if you're putting your body through all of that oregano oil and black walnut and berberis for no reason, it's almost like going on an antibiotic for no reason. So
Sure.
Just be very cognizant of those things. But just going back to your child, we have a dog. We have a German Shepherd at home, and he licks like the inside of her face, of her mouth all the time because they play and her mouth is always open. And yeah, there's a part of me that kind of cringes, but at the same time, I'm like, you go, girl. Like you get exposed to everything you possibly can, and if it becomes a problem, we'll treat you. It's not something that really worries me all that much.
Yeah, I agree with you. I know some people kiss their dogs, like tongue and all this sort of stuff. Not French kiss, but they get all. And I don't necessarily do that, but like you, I'm not gonna like run and grab my daughter if she's like in their face and licking it. Whatever. I just let her.
I mean, there comes like one lick is enough from my dog. I mean, I'm not
kind of push them away.
Consume the face. Yeah.
If they can get carried away.
Right.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. That one of the companies that comes to mind, I think Pacana. I have a friend, Sean Naylor in Denver, Colorado, that really uses their homeopathics and has pretty good feedback there with that. And so one of the pharmaceutical compounds, tinidazole, I know a lot of practitioners really get excited about that. Do you have any experience with that? I know it's related to Flagyl and.
I don't, unfortunately. It just isn't something that I've worked with. Typically, most of the patients that I treat, we can treat them naturally. Quite easily, but I have not used that medication or had any patients with that medication.
Okay. Yeah, I know people talk about that. And so what's interesting is you brought up this notion that you can get worse before you get better. And to me, I learned that when I first did some heavy metal chelation. I had high levels of mercury and cadmium and lead. And so I thought, okay, I'll just do some, 10 treatments of EDTA and DMPS. And yep. I retested, the same way that I tested before using the same, provoking agent. And my levels were so much higher than when they initially were. And I was like blown away. So is this similar to the bugs where like when you start stirring the pot, then we see things rise? And then, how long do you see that, when do symptoms kind of normalize and people start to feel better?
People will start to feel better after that first 30 days if they're doing everything correctly. Or they might start to find that things get a little bit worse or their skin rash flares up. But if there's any sort of a shift, I always look at it as a good thing. Whether it's a good or bad symptom, we are creating some sort of a change in the body and it's not maintaining its status quo. So it does all depend. For some people, it's a really quick fix. After 30 days, they're done. For other people, it's been so deep-seated and it's been so chronic that it's just going to take a little bit more time to do it. Keeping in mind that we haven't even discussed making sure that the liver is filtering toxins well and that the gut is completely healed, which you can definitely learn more about in our other podcast. So there's other elements that are involved here for sure. And heavy metals can continuously cause yeast overgrowth. For instance, like mercury is an incredible trigger for yeast. So, if we're not establishing or not removing all potential triggers, then it's just sort of like a peeling away the layer of the onion. So, sure. Sometimes the layers are a little bit deeper than others and sometimes they're really shallow. But while we're talking about heavy metals, it's always in the best interest to treat the infection first and then the metals, not necessarily the other way around, because then the infection will always persist despite the fact that you're removing the metals. And I'm also not a huge proponent of making people feel so ill that they can't continue. There is something to be said about doctor do no harm, right? So please don't rush into it. Don't gravitate towards like the fastest treatment possible because your body is not going to be able to keep up.
Yeah, great tip there. Now, is a Herxheimer or die-off reaction normal in your experience when doing these protocols, or do you generally find people can tolerate them? Any feedback there?
You know what? I haven't had too many people complain of it, unless I was, going down the wrong path. I had one patient who actually had Lyme disease with all the other co-infections. So what we originally thought was yeast was much deeper and much more serious. So she was very, very sensitive just because her immune system was just completely shot. But for most people, if we've done the right testing and we're on the right path, I haven't really had too many people complain. If anything, they just say that they're starting to notice energy levels are coming back. Sleep is starting to get better. Their bowel movements are more regular. All the positive things that we want to see, not so much the negative.
That's good. Good to hear. Now, you kind of touched on it a little bit. Maybe we can finish off here, Dr. Maxim, is digestion. So one reason that dogs can eat like raw poultry is because their hydrochloric acid levels are a lot more acidic than ours, for example. So when getting people back on more of a maintenance route, looking at bile and looking at hydrochloric acid and things that will help to keep the microbial balance in check, what sort of tips for, practical things that people can do at home to ensure that their HCl and bile is working properly?
Very simply with HCl, apple cider vinegar right before a meal, a little teaspoon can trigger that salivary response, which then triggers the stomach acid to secrete. So just getting that natural timing back in, eating a little bit slower, not on the run, smelling your food before you eat it triggers all those natural things to be released. In short term, I am not opposed to people doing digestive enzymes, and the digestive enzymes I always encourage should have a little bit of HCl and bile in it, just to exactly support all of those organ systems. But, making sure that there isn't anything that could be persisting low stomach acid. H. pylori is something we know a lot of people are exposed to and have no idea. Gallbladder stones and gallbladder inflammation is also something that goes very undetected. And there's quite a bit of correlation between parasite overgrowth and gallbladder disease. Because as far as I've been told from my colleagues, a lot of parasites love to live in the gallbladder for whatever reason. So, kind of monitoring those type of things. But I really do find that the main reason why people aren't digesting their foods very well and therefore allow for food sensitivities and fungal and parasite overgrowth to occur is because we're just now so go, go, go. We're not resting and digesting. We're just snack, snack, snack on our way. Eat food really quickly, get the kids out the door. And we're not eating a well-cooked meal. It comes at the door and therefore we just eat it out of the box or out of the container, right? So there's some elements of that are very easy. And of course, if it requires further things like even doing the stomach acid challenge, where you do the HCl capsules, which I do caution people on because there's a certain threshold for that as well. Or what I do in office is like a zinc tally test. Zinc tally solution will allow you to discover, is your zinc status adequate? And if your zinc status isn't, could it be that your other minerals also are not? And that's another sort of indirect way to look at stomach acid testing. Because if you're not absorbing any of your minerals, most likely your stomach acid is quite low. So any of those things would be a good place to start without going crazy. And then, of course, the biggest thing that I'll always recommend is after doing at least a month of parasite or yeast cleansing or detoxing, however you want to put it, definitely getting into the high dose probiotics is huge. Just to, again, put that last coat of paint on the digestive tract and really get that immune system nice and primed.
Right. Especially after those, kind of caustic herbs like you talked about.
Sure. Absolutely. And definitely while you're doing anything like this, you have to be having bowel movements on a regular basis. So investing in maybe high dose magnesium oxide, which is a very strong laxative, or herbal laxatives, would be definitely important here. Because if your bowels aren't releasing, you're not getting rid of any of those bugs.
Yeah, great tips. I'm glad you're bringing back the importance of digestion and hydrochloric acid and eating mindful, and something we do talk about quite a bit. But, it's easy to get, kind of caught up in kind of the trending and sexy, things like mold, for example, which are really cool and innovative and all that. But it's nice to bring it back to the basics and things like Jonathan Wright talked about, back in the 80s and 90s, and hydrochloric acid and digestion and eating mindfully. And it's funny, I've been to a lot of medical conferences over the last 10 years, and I see doctors just wolf down their food, and so this is something, and I'm not picking on doctors at all. I just want to highlight
for people.
It's people in general.
Yeah.
And even though, we all know this, generally to be true, and our grandmother told us to eat mindfully and chew your food and stuff, we struggle with it because the pace of our society is so high. And then social media and then our smartphones are always connected to our hip with email. And so it's hard to do. So I just wanted to reinforce that people should always be striving for optimal, when it comes to eating mindfully. So great tips there. Anything else before we go to some final questions that we didn't get to cover that you wanted to kind of share with our listeners?
No, I really loved how this podcast kind of organically just went to all these different places. I thought it was phenomenal. And we touched on a lot of really wonderful things. And just the final statement I'll say, just while we're talking about the basics, is that's really the mainstay of my practice in Ontario, is just teaching people the fundamental things that have to be in place for your body to function. And I find even in my own naturopathic communities, we get so involved with, you have to put them on these 12 different supplements. That's the only way they're going to get better. And I work on a very minimalistic approach. You have to, number one, take responsibility for your lifestyle and your triggers and things like that. But we really only treat one thing at a time. I don't treat the entire person. I, again, peel away the layers. And for a lot of the people that are listening, it's so easy to get inundated by information. And, this person says I should be taking these 5 supplements, and this person said I should be doing these 5 things, and this person says I should be ordering it from, wherever, Australia, to do this particular thing. And the way I always like to think about it is, before we had any of these supplements and before we had any of these gadgets and testing abilities, how was it that people cured themselves? And it was always very, very simple approaches. So I just don't want people to go crazy and do everything and say, this is definitely it, and I'm going to attack it with everything that I possibly have. Really aligning yourself with someone who's educated on exactly what your body is trying to tell you can be very helpful. And when you do hit those Herxheimer reactions, or if you do have a flare up, you're not alone in treating that, because you have someone who's been there or has been through it, and say, okay, now we're going to adjust the dosage. Now we're going to make the dosage higher, or what have you. So I just always encourage people to not do it just based on what we're talking about here or what you read in a book. Really do connect with someone who you resonate with and who follows the same philosophies with you and who will support you 100% exactly when you need it. So that's why with my patients, they have me at their beck and call, whether they're in my office or not, because health doesn't work on a visit to visit basis. It just doesn't. So that's just the biggest word of caution and advice I would give everyone.
Yeah, that's really great information. Working with a practitioner that's been there and treated people with similar conditions that you're experiencing is fantastic. And for example, I mean, there's a lot of athletes that are professional athletes with a lot of experience that still have a trainer. Like they could probably do it without, but they still need a trainer. There's successful entrepreneurs that still have a business coach, and so I think it makes sense then, for people that want to maintain optimal health and to work with someone who's a professional. Just to get their annual labs and workups and bounce ideas off them, instead of just go on the internet and type in like headaches and gluten. Oh my gosh, that's, it's gluten, right? So I'm glad that you're bringing it home to that, because we all need a coach at some level. So
absolutely.
Great tips there. So along those lines, let's talk about your morning routine. So you're a mother now, you're running your business, you have several books and stuff like that. We know you're busy, and we know that the morning is a great time to kind of set the intention and productivity for the day. So what does the first couple hours of your day look like?
You know what? I am a big proponent for my body on intermittent fasting. So I don't do like the morning smoothie first thing. I don't do breakfast usually until around 11. So my morning is typically wake up, shower, feed the animals, get the dog out, feed the kid, and then pray that she'll go down for her first nap around 9 o'clock. And then that's usually when I'll start doing a bit of work. I tend to be the most, productive in the morning. So that's usually when I get the most work done. And then that's usually when I start seeing patients is afternoon, evening time. So yeah, that's when I do my accounting, my YouTube stuff, my social media sharing, and then I'll start eating. So it's not, the best morning routine, but I like the idea of the fasting part of it, because I'm not, focusing so much on creating the foods and rushing, because the mornings are usually the most hectic. And then by the afternoon, I'm good to go. I'm more relaxed. Everyone's been taken care of, and then I can start focusing on my meals.
Good for you. That's great.
Yeah.
Everyone's different, right? A lot of people just love to get up and eat a big breakfast. That's what I prefer, but that works for me, and the fasting works for you. So that's awesome. Now you said feed the animals. Do you have a farm or? Oh
my goodness. No, it seems like a zoo in my 3-bedroom condo townhouse, but we have 2 cats and a dog, and they all want to get fed as soon as the first human is awake. So we have to take care of them. And then of course the child.
Yeah, that's great. Fantastic. So, one thing that we've asked every guest on the show, and we had you on before, episode number 25, I believe, and that's your favorite herb, nutrient, or botanical or whole food substance. So if there was something you're going to be stranded on a desert island, vitamin D and essential fatty acids are covered, what would you take with you, and why?
I would take my black walnut tincture, or not walnut. Oh my goodness, I'm totally on that. My black currant tincture. Black currant has a beautiful affinity for the adrenal glands. And I should have included that in my morning routine. It's next to the toilet. So when I go to the washroom first thing in the morning, I always put 10 drops on my tongue. And I can't think of one person that doesn't need adrenal support. And while you're on that island, that's probably the best time to treat the adrenals, because you're finally relaxed versus the go-go pace that we're in, and being a mom and a business owner and doing all of those things. Like if I don't treat my adrenal glands, they're going to explode. Right. So definitely some sort of adrenal support. And for me, I love the black currant. I love the way it tastes. I love that it's in drop and liquid form. Of course, you can get it in other forms as well, but that is my mainstay nutrient that I wouldn't go without.
Fantastic. I have not experimented with that. I'll have to look that up and give that a shot. So great.
The Latin name is Ribes nigrum, so it goes with both names, but the black currant is the one that I'm using right now.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, I like currant, so I'm sure I'll like the black currant tincture. That's great. So Dr. Maxim, thanks so much for coming on the show again. I know you have some books and ebooks and videos and a great website. So maybe if you can tell our listeners where they can learn and connect with you, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I have my YouTube channel. Even if you just YouTube Andrea Maxim, you'll find my channel right away. My website is www.themaximmovement.com. On there, you'll see all the different tabs with my Maximize Your Digestion, your hormones, your weight loss, with all the videos categorized there for you to watch. And I did write Maximized Health, the new intelligence system for optimal digestion and hormones. And you can either get a hard copy or the downloadable version on my website as well.
Great. Thanks so much for coming on the show again, and hope you have a great day.
Yes, you too. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for tuning in to this episode of High Intensity Health Radio. I hope you found that discussion informative. I know I did. Dr. Maxim shared a lot of great tips, and don't worry, we take the show notes for you. And I posted the show notes and the video version of this interview at highintensityhealth.com/drmaxim. So thanks for tuning in, and thanks for subscribing, and we'll catch you on the next episode.